Is Dr. J, and you are watching week 3 for the course Immigration. This week we'll be talking about the melting pot, talking about different philosophical ideas, the history of the concept, and how possibly it could apply to current contexts in the United States. I'm going to delve a little bit into politics, hopefully, see that it's a very superficial understanding of politics, very complex issues. Of course, we are going into an era of a new administration with Donald Trump, and almost immediately after taking office, he has organized and implemented these very complex immigration policies that people who see themselves as supporters of immigrants as these policies tend to be seen as failures. So something to just sort of consider. I'm going to talk a little bit about this. Obviously, I know it's a very complex subject, and we're bridging historical and philosophical and contextual lines. So something you can think about too, something you can think about applying two different contexts and comparing them to one another. We read the article Callan, Democracy versus the Melting Pot, a study of American nationality by Horace M. Callan. I'll be referring to it as Callan throughout. We have this term, the melting pot. Maybe Gen Z and millennials might be more familiar with the national chain food restaurant, The Melting Pot, where you can go have high priced casual dining in any suburban or shopping mall you want. Specifically, fine dining based around the Scandinavian art of fondue and melting different sauces. I've never done it myself, but it seems like a wonderful way to spend a Friday night. Nonetheless, when we talk about the melting pot, we're talking about something a little bit different. So imagine we got fun. Maybe you're more familiar with this fondue idea of the melting pot, but you have a bunch of different things and everything goes into the pot and everything becomes one. This melting pot blurs boundaries. It eliminates differences between foods. It eliminates differences between individuals, if we're seeing this metaphor of the melting pot applied to the United States. And everyone, although they started out as different, are now all the same. And this is an idea that Callan is really interested in exploring, particularly how, and this was published in 1915, how in 1915 many politicians who claimed to be patriots and upholding the values of democracy were also opposed to immigration. And there's another group of individuals who Callan most likely represents, and those individuals see immigration and democracy going hand in hand, particularly in the United States, where we are a country that is defined by a 200 or 300 year history of colonization and immigration. I'm going to be going through and just sort of unpacking what Callan is saying throughout this article and applying it to some current contexts, providing some examples. The Declaration of Independence is how Callan starts off the article, looking and saying that the Declaration of Independence is a collection of glittering generalities. The concept of natural rights opposed to divine rights were important when writing this document. And by making this distinction, the founding fathers refused customary obedience to traditional superiority. So, thinking about who has divine rights in 1776, those who have divine rights are the royals, are the people that are born and raised in nobility. In contrast, we see that there's natural rights. Those are the rights that the founding fathers are writing their Declaration of Independence about. Those natural rights oppose the divine rights. Divine rights are exclusive. Natural rights are universal. Glittering generalities. Another quote from Callan: "The danger comes once more from a force across the water, but the force is this time regarded as superior, but as inferior. The relationships of 1776 are consequently reversed. To converse the inalienable rights of the colonists of 1776, it was necessary to declare all men equal. To conserve the inalienable rights of their descendants in 1914, it became necessary to declare all men unequal. In 1776, all men were as good as their betters. In 1914, men are permanently worse than their betters. A nation may reason," writes Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, throughout this article, is someone who Callan is writing to. So we have in 1915 debates about immigration restriction. Ross was in support of immigration restriction, and Callan is writing this article in opposition to Ross. We're not going to read Ross, but Ross is a principal player in this conversation. "A nation may reason," writes Mr. Ross, "why burden ourselves with the rearing of children? Let them perish unborn in the womb of time. The immigrants will keep up the population. A people that has no more respect for its ancestors and no more pride of race than this deserves the extinction that surely awaits it." Let's unpack this paragraph. This is 1915 conversation. So there's some very hoity-toity, overly flowery expressions going on here. "The danger comes once more from a force across the water." Here we see a few sentences about the idea that the threat is coming from Europe, or coming more specifically from Southern and Eastern Europe, opposed to England, but still there's this sort of dynamic. And in contrast to 1776, in 1915, you see that the people that are coming from Europe are no longer welcome. That the people who exist in what is now the United States and what in 1776 would become the United States, those individuals that are located in that territory, in North America, in what will become the United States and what is currently the United States, those individuals say we are skeptical that those individuals coming from the other side of the pond are worthy of inclusion. This is sort of what Callan's getting at, and will be getting at throughout the article, that we went from a country that accepted immigrants and that defined ourselves as a society that was open doors, and now we see ourselves as a society of exception, one that is going to close the doors and encourage only certain people in, and maybe not even many people in at all. Trump, since taking office in 2025, has had some similar types of debates as to what Ross is articulating and what Callan is critiquing. There's a bunch of different examples here, but one really interesting example, especially for all of us because we're all students, is the fact that Trump has permitted and maybe even ordered his immigration enforcement officials to go into schools and to arrest undocumented immigrants in schools. Sort of a sacred place, sort of a place where people go to assimilate. Most undocumented immigrants going to school are not going to be in any way a threat. In contrast, if you look statistically, they have very high class mobility. They're going to go and learn the language. They're going to be assimilated into the broader populace. What we see here is, and this reflects the debate on the previous slide, that these individuals who are being hunted down in schools have not yet proven themselves sufficient enough to be part of the American populace, to be part of the American way of life. Similar to the debate between Callan and Ross, that was a debate between whether or not individuals coming from Europe at the time in 1915 were worthy of acceptance into the United States. That's a very similar debate that we see going on now, because we have these schools, the gateway to citizenship and participation in society, are now being closed off before people are given a chance to prove themselves. Here is an example of a news story from 1915. So the debate between Callan and Ross is really playing out about European immigration. Eastern European and Southern European immigration was very controversial in 1915 to the 1930s. And with the Great Depression in the 1930s, a lot of these anti-immigrant policies won out. But between about 1880 and 1910, millions of people immigrated from Eastern Europe and from Southern Europe. It was a dramatic ethnic and cultural change in the United States, which had principally been descendant of Anglo-Saxons, with some minor exceptions to Germans and French, and some other smaller countries and pockets of ethnic minorities in places throughout the colonies. That Anglo-Saxon, that predominantly English identity, transformed into one where you had an almost equal number of Italians and Greeks and Russians and Poles walking the streets of New York. And so what the proposal was in 1950 was to reduce, for the majority of these countries, the potential to immigrate. If you look at the image on the left, it's Europe. Britain has about 50,000 people immigrating per year in 1915. You can see Italy has a pretty significant amount, as many as 50,000. Similarly with Poland, and similarly with Russia, I think it goes down to about 30,000. But still, millions of people over the course of decades, and becomes some years, particularly in the 1890s and 1900s, these numbers just dramatically spike. And what the goal would be then would be to maintain the levels of immigration from Great Britain, which are about 50,000 or above 50,000 in this scheme, but then to reduce most other types of immigration besides possibly Germany. But Germany also sort of reduced compared to what it was in pre-1915. And you see a dramatic reduction. So Russia, for example, goes from the potential to have 30,000 immigrants to then only have 5,000. This is pretty problematic, pretty explicit attempt to limit what was then considered a undesirable ethnic minority. I was born and raised in a Polish Catholic household, and these were types of conversations that my grandma always used to have. Oh, there's a lot of discrimination against Polish people. And me growing up in the 1990s and early 2000s, I thought, what a ridiculous thing to think that people are discriminating against Polish people. But it was a concern. You can think about the idea of immigration being contextual, not just in terms of the countries that are involved, but the times and the political currents that are important during a moment of immigration. Continuing with a Callan quote, fully to understand the place and function of the old world and the new, and the attitude of the new world towards the old, demands an appreciation of the influence of these primary and ultimate standard upon all the peoples who are citizens of the country. I have the idea of the melting pot. I have an image here of a very famous play, The Melting Pot, that tries to capture this sentiment that there's a bunch of people coming from all over the place and then becoming one. This, the old versus the new, obviously Europe is the old and the new is the United States. The tension here is, at what point should these two mix? At what point is the mixture between the old and the new in the melting pot a good thing? Do we want to limit the progress that is taking place in a democratic and capitalist United States? At this time in Europe, there was still a number of royal families ruling, going to war. 1915, if you remember from high school history, was World War I. So we have great famine, we have great war and great conflict, and then you go to the United States and you can enter the melting pot. But what is the role of those old world types of thinking in the new world? What is the role of the new world when it comes to trying to shepherd the old world to some type of future? And this is sort of the debate. And this is a debate that happens in 1915. It's also one that's happening right now. What is the role of the United States to lead the world? And what is the role of the United States to accept people from other parts of the world, embrace their cultures, and learn and try to adapt and become more healthy and functional and efficient and prosperous society? Look, here in contemporary political conversations, doesn't necessarily directly relate to immigration, but Trump and the collapse of the old order. This is a Wall Street Journal opinion article, and the author, Peggy Noonan, is skeptical about the break that Trump promises to make from the past. He has, according to Noonan, tendencies to resemble more of a oligarch or an authoritarian, which is not in line with how Americans perceive their political arrangements and institutions. And rather, the break from the past is going to be an alignment with historically prosperous countries and isolating lesser countries of lesser importance from the political discussion. So, this idea of what's the role of the old world. China and Russia are very much the old world, and the United States is still the new world. But when I look at this image, I see three leaders. All of them are above 60, maybe even all are in their 70s already, and they are a bunch of old men running the world. So this is what the article is about, what Peggy Noonan is talking about. Like, okay, there's these promises to break from the past, but what we see in practice is a bunch of people doing exactly the same thing, and actually they are not breaking from the past in a democratic or libertarian way, but rather they are entrenching these more oppressive forms of social systems. This is a debate about immigration, a debate about world policy, a debate about how countries and societies interact with one another. Continuing with Callan, we have in 1776, the mass of white men in the colonies were actually, with respect to one another, rather free and rather equal. So if you were a white man and not a woman, or not an indigenous person, or not someone who was enslaved, you had a really good chance of being treated equally and fairly under the law and in everyday circumstances. Callan says, I refer not so much to the absence of great differences in wealth as to the fact that the whites were like minded. They were possessed of ethnic and cultural unity. They were homogenous with respect to ancestry and ideals. So there was several different points, principally because they were Anglo-Saxon, that they could communicate, they could share practical assumptions about everyday interactions, and it eliminated a whole lot of social and political tension when it comes to assimilating new waves of immigration. Here's a modern example of attitudes that are being shared. So it's a graph that says African Americans' attitudes towards potential microaggressions. Microaggressions are not necessarily overtly racist things, but things that can come across as racist, or things that are coded as racist, or things that, if you are aware of the history of racism, are known to be racism. So there were two questions that were asked of a group of individuals. What is your feeling when a white person says, I don't notice people's race? The other question is, what is your feeling when a white person says America is a colorblind society? We have two groups of African Americans, people who self-identify as liberal and people who self-identify as conservative. And then we have three levels of responses: pleased, neither, or offended. And what we can see here, just thinking about the division, the political division of people, and just these very basic phrases that very much elucidate ideas about politics. I don't notice race when someone says that. Liberal African Americans tend to be more offended than pleased. Conservatives tend to be more pleased than offended. And we can see similar trends when we're looking at America is a colorblind society. Most people are offended. And then we see sort of an interesting trend. The conservatives are also somewhat offended. So it follows a little bit of a different path. But we see here just like difference of opinion. I think that's what we can look at. And even within groups, within ethnic groups, we can see significant amount of diversity of opinion, something that didn't necessarily, according to Callan, exist in 1776 United States. Continuing with Callan, similarly animated groups of Frenchmen and Germans in Louisiana and Pennsylvania regarded themselves as the cultural peers of the British, and because of their own common ancestry, their like-mindedness and self-consciousness, they have retained a large measure of their individuality and spiritual autonomy to this day, 1915. After generations of unrestricted and mobile contact and a century of political union with the dominant British populations. On the right hand of the screen, there is a map of what ethnic settlement groups looked like in what would become the United States in 1755. And you can see that the vast majority are English and Welsh. There are some Dutch communities in New York and encroaching on the southern part of New England. You see Scottish communities and pockets of Scottish communities, specifically in the mountains of North Carolina. And then you can see African Americans or African communities, enslaved African communities, as well as indigenous populations once you get to those Appalachian mountains. So there were pockets in 1755 of principally Germans and people that were English or English adjacent. Continuing with Callan, first came the Irish, integral to the polity of Great Britain, but ethnically different, Catholic in religion, fleeing from economic and political oppression, and self-conscious and rebellious. So what Callan is alluding to here is that the initial other, the initial immigrant that came to the United States that didn't necessarily conform with the Anglo-Saxon identity were the Irish. Irish people, of course, speak English, but they are ethnically different. They have had a different political history, and to this day, many Northern Irish people consider themselves to be colonized by the British. It's a colony in Europe. It's probably the only colony in Europe, or the only colony that really exists in the whole world at this moment, and that is Northern Ireland. And because of that, you see this tension that forms between the Anglo descendant population that has existed in the United States for generations and a new population of Irish people that are Catholic. The majority of Americans at this time are Protestant, and that they are somewhat different in terms of habit and composure. They are self conscious of their difference, they announce their differences, and they are also rather rebellious. So they are not necessarily in the United States to conform to everything that is American and everything that is Anglo. And in this image, you can see a political cartoon, Irish whiskey, lager beer. So this is obviously a caricature of an Irish person and a German person, associating them with alcoholism. And then in between them, these two caricatures wearing barrels of alcohol, literal barrels of alcohol, are carrying a ballot box, and they are walking away from a riot. So these were just a reflection of some of the dominant mentalities towards immigrants in the United States in the 1910s and 1915, I should say. Not necessarily a positive description, one that elucidates the political and the social tension that existed. So Mr. Ross thinks that they have their virtue still to prove. How, he does not say. So Mr. Ross, Callan is saying, is being a little bit too conservative when it comes to the qualities of someone who belongs in the United States. And conservative in just a very general sense, not necessarily in a political sense. The idea that there's a really high standard of virtue to come into the United States. You have to be a good person. You have to get along with everybody. You have to get the American way of life. You have to be productive. You have to be faithful. You have to be all these different types of things. And you have to also contribute to the United States. How can you prove that you've done that, all those things, before you even arrive? And so this is sort of what Callan's saying, is that these people who are opposed to immigration for the sake of preserving what is the United States, those individuals don't necessarily have a concrete idea themselves of what the United States is, and they don't offer alternative paths for people to come in. Let's say you got to go get a college degree in order to be a citizen. You got to make a path. You got to make that institution willing to accept immigrants. Otherwise, it's just a way to restrict immigration, another way to restrict immigration. Behind the Irish came the great mass of the Germans. So there was an initial German migration to Pennsylvania, but then there was an even more significant German migration that took over the American Midwest. So like Wisconsin, Minnesota, Illinois, Iowa, Michigan, Indiana, Ohio. Sometimes they include, Nebraska and Kansas and Missouri, but those can be maybe the West or the South, depending on who you're talking to. But you can see in all these regions, stretching out to Colorado, that there was a mass migration of Germans in the 1880s to 1910s. And here to this day in 2020, there is 44 million people in the United States that claim German ancestry, and that's compared to the 46 million that claim English and the 38 million that claim Irish ancestry. So Germans had a significant impact in the United States from about 1850 to 1900. Scandinavians, and I'm not going to read this whole thing, this is another paraphrase, but we see Scandinavians, Slavs, Finns, all inhabiting the Rockies, specifically Colorado and Utah and Wyoming. We see that there is French Canadians going and moving down into Louisiana. And then we can see that there are quote unquote Asiatics living on the West Coast. So these Asiatics would be most likely Chinese and Japanese migrants. And you can see here pockets of where different ethnic minorities have a hold on the population. A majority of the population can look at, I'm just going to look at Colorado here. If you look at Pueblo County, I am not seeing, I'm pretty sure it looks like it's Mexican migrants, but then once you get out of Pueblo County, it is mostly German, generic Hispanic or Spanish, so not necessarily referring to a country identity, but broader colonial heritage. And then you also have the Irish, right? So you have this significant diversity of immigrant populations. They sort of whole villages uproot from Europe and move and form new cities in the United States. And this is sort of a standard practice from 1800 to about 1920. You'd see just these waves and waves of immigrants coming from Europe. South of Mason and Dixon's line, the cities exhibit a greater homogeneity outside of certain regions in Texas. The descendants of the native white stock, this is, of course, Callan writing, the native white stock often degenerate and backwards prevail among the whites, but the whites as a whole constitute a relatively weaker proportion of the population. They live among 9 million African Americans. Most own mode of living tends, by its mere massiveness, to standardize the mind of the proletarian South in speech, manner, and values of social organization. So what we see here is that there was a very distinct set of migratory patterns in the South of the United States, and that was for several reasons, but the South did not necessarily industrialize until after the Civil War, and by that time the South was sort of a war-torn area. The people who were available to work in the South, African Americans, would be very high levels of competition to low-paid European immigrants, and so Europeans tended to not move because it was just too much competition in the South for them, and they ended up moving to other parts of the country, particularly the big cities on the East Coast, the Midwest, and the West in general. And as such, and this is sort of an interesting dynamic that gets discussed by Callan, is that the working class, the proletariat white population in the South, tended to adapt and adopt the habits and mannerisms and cultural background of African Americans more than they assimilated the cultural backgrounds and the traditions of Europeans. So in the South, this is just sort of me going out on a limb, you'll have fewer people talk about their ethnic descent, like, oh, I'm Polish, my grandma was Polish, right? You'll have fewer people saying that, and rather they'll just say they're American from the South. And we'll see a map that says very much that, that this sort of idea of having a European descent identity is not as prevalent in the South because there had been a different migratory pattern. Mr. Ross, continuing with Callan, thinks that their coming to America was determined by no spiritual urge, only the urge of steamship agencies and economic need or greed. Callan is referring to the argument that immigrants are just trying to take our jobs. That's sort of a phrase you hear people say, that immigrants are coming to the United States to take people's jobs. And one of the principal ways that you see immigration law getting enforced is arresting people and detaining people and expelling people from the country for working, deportation because people want to work a living. And Callan more or less is saying there isn't any other reason why people might want to move to the United States. They might not want to move to the United States because they're fleeing prosecution. They might not want to move to the United States so they can exercise their religion among like minded people. They might not want to move to the United States because they want to participate in a democratic society. They're only doing it because of money. And that's a very suspect line of thinking, according to Callan. And here on the right hand side of the screen, you'll see a caricature or a political cartoon of a poorhouse from Galway, a city in Ireland, on top of a boat coming to the United States. And then you see, and I'm not sure exactly what it says, but I'm pretty sure it is a Irish immigrant, a well-off looking Irish immigrant returning back to Ireland. And this happened a lot. You would see very well-off immigrants returning back to Ireland and building things and starting orphanages and things like that. And you can see the other side of this is that the population of the United States is somewhat suspicious that the poorest of the poor of countries that are poorer than the United States are going to come to the United States and somehow offer a form of contribution. Of course, this is once again a very problematic and prejudicial assumption. If you look at the individuals who come to the United States and work, undocumented individuals who are working in the United States, they tend to pay as much taxes as their citizen counterparts, and they also commit less crimes, and they also are just economic dynamos. So it's a problematic assumption that we can see has been in place for over 100 years. Callan refers then to liberal individualism, and this is the quote here: with our individualism go our optimism and our other pioneer virtues. They are purely reactions to our unexploited natural wealth, and as such, moods which characterize all societies in which the relation between population and resource is similar. So when you have a wealth of a land, when it seems like the whole land could be farmed and mined and exploited, that also means that you have people who are enriching themselves, not just materially, but also virtually and through morals and ethics. And this is just a normal type of optimism that needs to exist in a country where you're quote unquote conquering a frontier, even though there is indigenous people there, where you are going into a place where there's no quote unquote civilization, and you have to go and establish it. And this is a type of optimism. It requires rugged individualism. There's not going to be many people hanging out right next to you, helping you create the world that you want to create. So you have to be an individualist and you have to be optimistic. And who is more optimistic and individualistic than immigrants, according to Callan? Modern progress, this is sort of an interesting argument. You see Callan referred to time and again. The process of leveling up through imitation is facilitated by the so-called standardization of externals. In these days of ready-made clothes, factory-made goods, refrigerating plants, it is almost impossible that the mass of the inhabitants of this country should wear other than uniform clothes, use other than uniform furniture or utensils, or eat anything but the same kind of food. In these days of rapid transit industrial mobility, it must seem impossible that any stratification of population should be permanent. Hardly anybody seems to have been born where he lives or to live where he has been born. So this is just, I sort of think, a really poetic way of saying that we have just this excellent ability to assimilate. We have this excellent capacity and institution around us that should make assimilation really easily happen. And then also, we can see that with such a universal standardized economy, that people normally aren't staying in one place throughout the entirety of their lives. Even if you are someone who was born in the United States, you are more than likely in the 1915 to migrate to another part of the United States. So, what makes the average native born American any different than the immigrant coming from abroad who is also moving around and uprooting themselves and looking for new opportunities in this very viable, standardized type of economy? And on the map here, you can see just some interesting trends. In the Midwestern United States, you see a lot of people, 70 to 80%, are staying where they were born for the majority of their lives, at least very much in the state. I know I grew up in Wisconsin. Not many people leave, but if you go from Milwaukee to Madison, it's about a 2 hour drive. People treat you like you're in a different country. Whereas if you look at places like Nevada, and I think Nevada looks like it has the highest rates, Nevada and Florida and Washington D.C. sort of has a little bubble there in on the map as well. See higher levels of people moving in to the state. And I would just assume Nevada's gone through a dramatic form of urban development in the last few generations that it hadn't done in the past. And you can see places like Florida and Arizona. They're attracting a lot of people, like retirees, for example. I know a lot of people in Florida and Arizona that are moved there as retirees. So you have all these different reasons why possibly people are brooding. But once again, this idea that hardly anybody seems to have been born where he lives or to live where he has born. This is a reality that we can see nowadays in the United States, and the same type of argument can exist. If people are constantly moving around anyways, why don't we accept the people who are constantly moving around? If natives are constantly moving around, why don't we accept the immigrants who are doing the exact same thing? Continuing with Callan, the restrictions of immigration can naturally succeed only with the restriction of the entrepreneur's greed, which is its cause. But the abolition of immigration and the restoration of the supremacy of human rights over property rights will not abolish the fundamental ethnic dualism. It may aggravate it. So you can look up where this is in the Callan article. But what you see is that this idea of entrepreneurial greed is a necessity to go and create things, is a necessity for the American spirit and for Americanization. But the abolition of immigration and the restoration of not just human rights, but just sort of this older form of nationalism that exists in the United States, that will not necessarily interrupt the types of tensions that take place between immigrants and non-immigrants. Just to put it in like maybe one or two sentences in a little bit simpler way, we can see that there is a need for immigrants in our economy. And even if we just make an appeal to human rights instead of just economic rights, we are still going to have a tension between individuals who were born in a place and people who are coming to a place. And I have here too, there's Trump's immigration crackdown could play havoc with the economy. This is still the case nowadays. You have a great number of immigrants working in the economy, often in the service sector, often working in the construction sector, often doing these very essential jobs to maintain a high quality of life in the United States. And with the crackdown on immigration, particularly undocumented immigrants, there is going to be a significant chance that prices might change, that services might be interrupted, and it might make the economy less prosperous. Continuing, of the 30,000 Belgians in Wisconsin, this is Callan talking, with their Belgian language, a mixture of Walloon and Flemish, welded by reaction to a strange social environment. This is a painting that was painted in the 1920s, and you can see people wearing clogs. Those aren't Uggs. Those are people stepping off the boat in wooden clogs, very similar to what the Belgians wear. And there was a little pocket. I'm from Wisconsin, mentioned it a few different times. There's a little pocket of Belgians and Belgian descendant people in the middle of Wisconsin. And if you are good with accents, you might be able to hear my accent. But a lot of people assume that the particular Midwestern accent is descendant of this mixture of Belgians and Scandinavians in the interior of Wisconsin and Minnesota. This is a continuation. I don't know why Callan is so interested in Wisconsin, but it caught my attention, so we're going to roll with it. The eastern neighbor of Minnesota is Wisconsin, a region of great concentration of Germans. There's a huge number of Germans and German descendant people in Wisconsin to this day. It is merely a political accident that the centralization of state authority and control has been possible there to a degree heretofore unknown in this country. So what Callan is saying, that the Germans came to Wisconsin and they got an anchorhead and they established themselves and they got political autonomy within the United States. That the socialist organization is the most powerful in the land. Wisconsin is the home of the American Socialist Party. We've elected socialist government officials to almost all level of government besides the governor's office. But we've had socialists as the mayors of the largest cities, and we've had socialists sent to Congress. So that the socialist organization is the most powerful in the land, able under ordinary conditions to have elected the mayor of a large city, Milwaukee, and also other cities, and a congressman, and kept out of power only by the coalition of other parties. That German is the overwhelmingly predominant foreign language in public schools and in the university, or that the fragrance of Deutschtum pervades the life of the whole state. And I think this is sort of a allusion to culture. The Dutch culture, the German culture is pervasive. It is ubiquitous. It is everywhere in Wisconsin. The earliest German immigrants to America were group conscious to a high degree. They brought with them a cultural tradition and political aspiration. They wanted to found a state. If a state is to be regarded as a mode of life of the mind, they have succeeded. Their language is the predominant foreign one throughout the Middle West. So what you see is a mass of Germans moving to Wisconsin, taking over the political scene, making it required that the next generation of Wisconsinites also learn German, and that they have their political and social and cultural will recognized within the United States. And here's just a example. 1910, the residents of Wisconsin with German stock or of principally German origin. If you look on the east coast of Wisconsin, that lower east, southeast part of Wisconsin, you'll see a higher concentration of Germans. And that's where Milwaukee is and the major population centers. And then once you go out to the middle of the state, you're going to see a lot more of the German descendant Luddite communities, particularly Mennonites and Amish. So you get this whole spectrum of German culture just within Wisconsin. And it's pretty prevalent today. You can still learn German in most public high schools in Wisconsin. I think if you go throughout the rest of the United States, the best you'll get is Spanish if you get a non-English language. Another example, which is sort of interesting, and just to sort of think about, and this is sort of deviating from Kalin just a little bit, but I think it sort of gives a really good illustration of what Kalin is talking about. The Turners, these were a group of Germans founded in 1811 by revolutionary Frederick Ludwig Jahn. The Turners began as a political organization with the goal of ousting Napoleon from Prussia and unifying the divided German states. At this time, there was still the Holy Roman Empire, there was still Prussia, there was a fragmented Germany, and the Turners said, let's get our own country, like the Americans have their own country, and the French have their own country, and the English have their own country. Let's have our German country. After the failed 1848 revolution, there was a democratic and socialist revolution in 1848, mostly all across Europe, actually, but Germany was sort of the epicenter of it. It failed. 500,000 Germans fled to places like New York, Cincinnati, and Milwaukee. We would use the term refugees nowadays, where they founded German colonies with German language newspapers, German theater, and more. And the Turners were this essential social organization. They were like the YMCA. They were like the Shriners. They were like the Moose Lodges. They were just this good social organization where you could go and do some physical activity and associate with your neighbors. So there was another aspect that was brought up about Milwaukee and German descendants. Berger, this was the socialist congressman that was mentioned by Kalin, was the founder of the American Socialist Party and was elected to United States Congress in 1910. And I believe he was elected up until like the 1930s or something. He was a rather controversial figure outside the United States or outside of Wisconsin, but he was very much a dominant political figure and defined politics in Wisconsin for 30, 40 years, even after his death. He was based out of this building. So this was one of the 3 Turner halls that existed in Milwaukee. And these were just the country clubs, the YMCAs. It existed in Milwaukee, I believe, from the 1890s, 1892. And this was just the building. I think the Turners existed before then, but the building was built in 1892. You can look it up if you want to see what it looks like inside. There's a bunch of photos of it inside. And they used the building rather successfully up until the start of World War II. And then the German Socialist Organization, in the lead up to World War II, made the heinous mistake of siding with the Nationalist Socialists of Germany, which are also known as the Nazis. So they more or less sided with the Nazis. And then as World War II heated up, both socialism went out of favor and parading around your German identity went out of favor in Wisconsin. And it still sort of exists nowadays, but when I look at pictures of grandparents and all the old parties, they're all German parties. It was all German. It was all German stuff. Everyone's wearing German clothes and all that kind of stuff. So after World War II in the 1940s and 50s, you start seeing African Americans move to the neighborhood, and you can sort of see this on the map below. All those red outlines on that map are houses. All the plots of land, all the squares without red in them, are places where houses have been torn down. So this is now in one of the least populated and underdeveloped parts of Milwaukee. It's pretty close to downtown, but it's a pretty poor neighborhood. The Germans moved out in waves in the 1930s and 40s, and they moved to the suburbs in the 1950s and depopulated. So the Germans left the neighborhood. African Americans moved in, and then just intense poverty. There was riots in the 1960s that burned down a bunch of houses. And then you start having really exploitative landlords. People don't invest in houses. The neighborhood just goes downhill. And now this building, you can get this huge 25,000 square foot building for $40,000 with all this history. But it's sort of, I think, a really good symbol. Just looking at Turner Hall is what this was called. Looking at Turner Hall it's a really good symbol of how this sort of immigrant identity at one time was monumental and significant and has since become sort of abandoned and dilapidated. Immigrants appear to pass through four phases in the course of being Americanized. Thinking about this Turner Hall, thinking about the Turners, right? And this is returning back to what Kaylin is talking about. This is a paraphrase of what Kaylin talks about. In the first phase, they exhibit economic eagerness, the greed of the unfed. What a lovely statement. The greed of the unfed, the hunger of people who have no food. Once the proletarian level of such independence is reached, so they now are able to feed themselves, the process of assimilation slows down and tends to come to a stop. So once they have met a certain level of material success, at least with that first generation, there is a broader process of just sort of being an economic participant and doing your own thing. And then, third phase, there's a process of desimilation. So, reinvigorating your ethnic identity, supporting that identity of a Turner. I'm going to go to a German club. I'm going to go to the Turner Club. The arts, life, and ideals of the nationality become central and paramount. So this idea of a Irish identity, Italian identity, all these types of clubs existed in the 1910s up until the 1950s. On the whole, then, Americanization has not repressed nationality. Americanization has liberated nationality. It has made nationality acceptable within this diverse melting pot environment. And if you're wondering what the fourth phase is here, then it would be the process of the next generation sort of forgetting their ethnic identity and losing it. Very similar to what Turner Hall does. So human flow, we're not going to talk too much about human flow this week. We'll get into it next week. There is a number of stories. Once again, it is more or less just a primary document. There are literally dozens of essays and dozens of interviews of people who are immigrating, people who are refugees in a different time and a different place. We are comparing all different types of immigration and all different types of refugees in this class throughout the semester. Human flow is a type of mass migration. The human flow that Ai Weiwei, the author, is documenting is one that parallels, particularly the number of immigrants coming to Europe, parallels the number of immigrants that came from Europe to the United States, which I think is really interesting. And of course, Ai Weiwei does not talk about this in his book, nor does Kellen talk about it in 1915, that there's this possible migration in the next 100 years in Europe that's going to look like the American one. But this is something that we can do in this class. We can look and compare these two contexts. I'm just going to rattle off some that I'm just thinking of some examples. There are photojournalists in human flow that have a very specific perspective on the immigrant crisis. There are other types of journalists. There's other non-governmental organizations or NGOs that are made up of immigrants or made up of Germans or made up of Slovenians. There's politicians. There's migrants themselves. There are people who never got out of the refugee camp. There's people that are completely assimilated. And then there are people that are really wary of dissimilation or of assimilation or of any number of things associated with immigrants or refugees in Europe. And so we're seeing all these very similar conversations taking place in 2016 in Europe as we did in 1915 in the United States. And so as we're reading this, as we're looking through all these different examples and case studies, we can ask ourselves, what is the eagerness of new immigrants? What are the individuals going from Turkey to Greece eager about? What are they trying to accomplish? What is the energy that they bring with them? Is there a hint of dissimilation? Is there any hint of assimilation? what is the role of these individuals coming principally from the Middle East and Africa to Europe, and how will they become members of that society? What are the arguments against immigrants and assimilation? There are numerous and multiple in each and every interview. Even if people support immigration, they will recognize what arguments are against immigrants and assimilation. So note those down. They're going to be very similar in many different ways to this melting pot idea. Europe is historically not a continent of immigrants. Recently, since World War II, they've reshaped that identity somewhat, but not every country has accepted immigrants, and not every population has had an easy go with immigrants as well once those immigrants came. So are the countries that are destined, are these countries, are they destined to be melting pots themselves? And what systems and people are in place to encourage the melting pot? Are there specific unique processes in Germany that is not necessarily American, right? How do they perceive assimilation? And what is the German version of the melting pot? So in conclusion, we can ask what happens when we use democracy to oppose the melting pot. That's something that we can see nowadays. We can see in 1915. This is a broader debate about immigration, particularly countries that accept more immigrants are these countries that propose democracy, that see themselves as democratic. And then within those same countries, you'll see people who are skeptical of immigrants, and they'll use the democratic system to reduce immigration. And then is immigration opposed to liberal democracy? Is the process of bringing people in from non-democratic countries and bringing them into our democracy, is that something that's going to taint our democracy and end our democracy? You see debates about this happen all the time, particularly in England, where they allow religious courts to have the same authority as other non-religious courts, more traditional courts, when it comes to some lower level offenses. What does it mean? Are we replacing the system of liberal democracy with something else because we're just going to accept a bunch of immigrants? Or is immigration part and parcel of liberal democracy? And these are questions we're going to be asking throughout our class. It's not going to be an easy question to answer at all. You might have an opinion, but then what our goal now is to build out that opinion, hear other people's opinions, and develop evidence through things like Ai Weiwei's Human Flow, or through some of these other case studies that we're reading. Gather evidence to support your opinion.